All right, let's get right into it. We're going to jump right in time, all the way to the 1830s, to tell a story about a king, his kingdom, and, well, the unstoppable force of change. We're talking about King Frederick VI of Denmark. Now, he was an absolute ruler, and he found himself completely stuck between the world he was born to rule and a future that was, demanding a voice of its own. Just take a look at this scene. I mean, it is the absolute picture of peace, right? You've got King Frederick VI just sailing along in a park in Copenhagen. For the Danish people, this was normal. This was a familiar sight. He was their king, a constant, the very symbol of a stable, unchanging Denmark. But as you can probably guess, under that calm surface, a political storm was brewing. So, to really get what's about to happen, we've got to understand the man at the center of it all. Who exactly was King Frederick VI in these last few years of his reign? And this is really crucial to get your head around. In the 1830s, while a lot of Europe was already playing around with constitutions and parliaments, Denmark was, well, it was old school. It was one of the last absolute monarchies. And that wasn't just a fancy title, you know? It meant that the king's personal word was the law. Period. No checks, no balances. He was the state. But no kingdom is an island. And in 1830, news started traveling north from France. And it carried some pretty dangerous, or, hey, inspiring ideas, really depending on who you asked. Yeah, the July Revolution in Paris. This was a big one. It proved that the old system could actually be changed. A king could be forced to accept limits on his power. Suddenly, this wasn't just some abstract political idea anymore. This was a real-world example. And you can bet people all over Europe, including in Denmark, were paying very close attention. And that inspiration, it didn't take long to turn into a specific demand. The call went out for something called a Stænderforsamling, basically an assembly of representatives. Now, people weren't trying to overthrow the king, not yet anyway. They just wanted a seat at the table. They wanted to be heard. And this chart, it lays out the conflict perfectly. On one side, you have the system that's in place. All the power, every last bit of it, is in the hands of one man. And on the other side, you've got this new idea, a group of representatives to advise the king, to give the people a voice. For a ruler like Frederik, this wasn't just some minor adjustment. No way. This was a challenge to the very foundation of his entire world. Of course, a king never rules in a total vacuum, right? As all this pressure started building, Frederik was getting two very, very different kinds of advice from the people closest to him, and they were pulling him in completely opposite directions. First up, you've got Stearman. Think of him as the voice of tradition, the old guard. He's described as pretty unimaginative, and he believed the best way to handle this whole complicated mess was, well, to just not handle it at all. He basically represented that powerful urge to just ignore the problem and play it goes away. But then you have Mynster, and he was the total opposite. He was the strategist, super clever, he really understood the king. And he knew that just burying your head in the sand was not a long-term plan. Mynster's whole approach wasn't about revolution. It was about smart adaptation. He was that voice whispering in the king's ear, hey, maybe it's better to bend a little now than to break completely later on. And this kind of thinking was really in the air at the time. There's this quote from the great Danish poet Grundtvig that just captures the mood perfectly. It says, "The church, it is an old house. It stands though the towers may fall." What he's getting at is this idea that the nation's core, that old house, it could survive, even if some of the outer structures, the towers, came crashing down. Change was coming, but the nation itself would endure. So, let's recap. You've got pressure from the outside, you've got advisors fighting on the inside, and you've got a whole nation starting to question its own foundations. And all of that, it landed right on the shoulders of one aging king. Something had to give. And you can just see how the whole crisis built up. The pressure from reformers, it just kept coming. His advisors were pulling him every which way. The king himself, who really hated complex problems, he tried to dodge making a decision. But eventually, the political reality just became impossible to ignore. And so, with what historians describe as a pale reluctance, he finally gave in. Now, you have to understand, for the king, this was not some glorious moment of reform. Not at all. It felt like a defeat. It was a concession that was forced on him, and it challenged everything he had ever been taught, everything he'd known his entire life as an absolute king. And this decision, it did more than just create a new political committee. It really marked the beginning of the end, both for King Frederick VI and for the entire system he stood for. After this whole ordeal, the king just seemed different. It was like the fight had taken something fundamental out of him. He became more withdrawn, more tired, and he seemed to be pulling away from the complicated political world that he used to be the absolute center of. And this is just such a humanizing, almost heartbreaking detail from the historical accounts. The king himself said that he felt it was all too much for him. I mean, think about that. The burden of trying to navigate this new world, a world he had reluctantly helped create. It was just too heavy for the old king to carry. King Frederick VI died in 1839, and while he didn't live to see Denmark get its full democratic constitution about a decade later, his reluctant decision had set the kingdom firmly on that path. His death really did mark the end of an era. So it all leaves us with this big question, doesn't it? The story of Frederick VI shows us a man from an old world being dragged kicking and screaming into a new one. And it makes you wonder, when all the power is held by just one person, is the end of their era the only real path to progress? It's a huge question, one about leadership, power, and the inevitable march of time.